My name is Ken Johnson. I'm a horticulture educator. I am based out of Jacksonville, Illinois. If you were not familiar with that, it's kind of west central Illinois. We're about 40 minutes west of Springfield. So today we're going to talk about several different things in regards to fall gardening. I'm not necessarily going to go into a lot of detail on any one thing, just kind of cover some of the basics, some of the things that we can and should be doing in the fall, or some things you may want to try to consider doing either this year or in the future. So first thing we'll talk about soil testing. This is a rather important thing for a lot of gardens that we typically overlook. We don't necessarily do as much as we should. So a couple different reasons why we want to be doing soil testing is one is to figure out what the pH of our soil is. Some of our plants require different levels of pH. So if you try to go blueberries, something like that, they're going to require more acidic soil. So you'd want to do test your soil to see the pH, to see if your soil's pH is the proper level for that, and then make any adjustments that you would need in order to grow some of these different crops. It's also going to let you see what the nutrient levels are like in your soil. Are you deficient? Do you have too much of some of these nutrients? What have you? And by doing that, that can help you save money in the long run, because you may have enough of some of these nutrients in your soil already, and you're not necessarily going to need to apply any fertilizers because you already have enough. And that's also going to be good for the environment, because you're not going to have to worry about potential runoff, leaching, other things like that. And then down here, the chart at the bottom there in the bottom corner, you can see right here, this is our essential plant nutrients here, and you can see that most of our nutrients are going to be most available at pH of 6.1 to 6.9, and that just happens to be where most of our plants are going to be most successful. So that's in general, that's kind of the pH we're aiming for most of our crops, or most of the plants we're going to grow. So when should you soil test? Really, you can soil test pretty much any time of the year as long as the soil isn't frozen. But fall is a really good time to do a soil test. If you incorporate any organic matter or you put any fertilizers down in the spring, those have had a chance to react with the soil, kind of incorporate into the soil, and it's going to give you a lot more accurate reading if you do that in the fall after everything's kind of settled out after the growing year. It's also going to give you enough time to adjust your pH of your soil if you have to do that. Adjusting pH can take a matter of months in some cases, so the sooner you do that, the more time you have to get that pH adjusted before we roll around to spring, where we're starting to do a lot of our planting and stuff like that. So how to go about taking a soil sample. It's really pretty simple. You need a bucket and something to dig with, whether that be a shovel, a spade, a trowel, basically anything you can dig with. And just keep in mind that if the soil is too wet to work, it's going to be too wet to sample. So if you wouldn't go out and till up your garden or do a lot of work in the garden because it's wet, same thing applies. You don't want to do a soil test. If you take a handful of soil and squeeze it and it holds that shape, more than likely it's going to be a little too wet. You need to wait a little bit longer before you go out and start working with the soil. So to do a soil test, and pick your area where you want to test, and you're going to remove any turf, plant residues, debris, anything like that from the surface. If you get that into the sample, that can kind of distort the readings, so you want to remove all of that. Dig a small hole 6 to 8 inches deep, slice down the edge of that hole, collect that soil into a bucket, and you're going to do that multiple times and mix all of those little slices together. So on the right here, in this picture, just kind of an example of a garden plot. You just want to take some random samples from around the garden, not all just in one corner or just in the middle, kind of a representative sample throughout that different plot. Combine all of those together, mix them together, and from that you will get your sample that you will send off. When you're looking at the area you're going to sample, you want to look to make sure the soil is kind of uniform in that area. So if you have different soil textures, different soil colors, if some areas drain better than others, you're going to want a different sample for each of those different types of soils. So if you've got an area that doesn't drain very well, you're going to sample that separately from the rest of your garden, just to make sure you're getting a good representative sample of that soil. So actually, after you've collected all that, you can then send that off off to a soil testing lab, and they'll test that, run an analysis, and you'll get your results back. And typically it's going to be a good idea. You're going to do separate samples if you're going to have a vegetable garden, a flower garden, lawn, etc. Those different plants that we're growing are going to have different nutrient requirements. So when you get your analysis back, if they provide an analysis for you, it's going to be based on what type of crop you're growing in there. So where can you get your soils tested? If you go to the Illinois Soil Testing Association, they have a list of companies that will do soil tests. They've all gone through some kind of accrediting, so in order to join that group. So these are all kind of legitimate places that you can send your soil off to get tested. When you're picking a place, it's probably a good idea to make sure that they will accept home or horticultural samples. If they're just doing like row crops, corn, soybeans, stuff like that, that test may not be all that useful for you. Try to pick someplace that does home or horticultural samples. It's also a good idea if you can find a place that will provide an analysis for you. Otherwise, you're just going to get a bunch of numbers and they're not really going to mean much to you. So look for one that provides an analysis, or you can bring your soil test by your local extension office, and then somebody there can help you read that test and decide what fertilizers and stuff you may need to apply to your landscape. So that's just kind of real quick on soil testing. Next, we'll get into turf. So fall is a good time of year to do a lot of our turf maintenance activities as well. So if we're going to be cultivating our turf, typically we're going to be doing that in the fall, September, October. If we're going to be planting a new yard or renovating a yard by seed, again, kind of that mid-August to mid-September time range, at least for central Illinois. Southern Illinois, northern Illinois, you're going to vary by a couple weeks, one way or the other. Establishment by sod, you can do that pretty much any time in the summer or fall. And if we're going to fertilize, kind of that September time range is a good time to fertilize as well. And it's important to note this is for cool season turf grasses, which is predominantly what we grow in Illinois. If you're growing a warm season turf grass, your timing is going to be a little bit different. You're going to be doing a lot of these activities more in the summer when your warm season grasses are actively growing. All right, so for our cultivation, aerification, this can help reduce thatch, relieve soil compaction. If you're going to do any kind of overseeding, can help get the soil ready for that. And if you're not familiar with thatch, that's kind of a spongy area, kind of dead turf, stuff like that. Typically, you see it a lot in yards that have a lot of inputs into them. So if you water, if you fertilize a lot, those types of turf and lawns tend to have more thatch than kind of your low input, low maintenance areas. Some thatch is good. It's going to help insulate the crowns of the plants, again, provide some of that sponge. But if you get too much thatch, you can start getting some problems with your turf, start getting some thinning and stuff like that in there. So that's something, if you do a lot of watering and fertilizing, you may need to do something like this to help reduce some of that thatch. There's a couple different ways we can cultivate or aerify lawns. First is by core aerification. That's this picture on the left here. Basically what this is doing, it's got a bunch of hollow spikes on them. They'll go into the soil and they'll remove these cores, and those cores are then placed on the top of the soil. It's not necessarily all that great looking. You have all these cores left on the top, but over time those will break down and return back to the soil. And this is going to be severing roots and stolons and stuff, kind of increasing or kind of causing that turf to grow more by doing that. It's also going to open up the soil, help with compaction, stuff like that. On the other hand, you also have solid tine. It's like the name implies. These are just solid metal rods that are basically being poked down into the soil. They're not removing any cores, so it doesn't do as good of a job as doing some of that aerification, but you don't have any of those plugs left on top of the soil. So it's a little more, it's not quite as unsightly as core aerification would be. And this is not necessarily something that needs to be done all that often. Kind of if you're in a low input type situation, maybe every couple of years to help relieve compaction, if that. And these things you can, if you have a place where you can rent, lawn equipment, stuff like that, a lot of rental companies will have these, or a lot of lawn care companies will also do aerification and stuff as well, if that's something you're interested in doing. Like I mentioned earlier, we can also do seeding in the fall, and when it comes to seeding our cool season turf grasses, fall is going to be the best time to do this. One, we have reduced weed competition. Most of the weeds that are out and about now, if they're annuals, they're not producing seed. They're not producing much more vegetatively. They're putting all their energy into seed production. Our more perennial weed species, those are starting to send their nutrients back down to the roots and whatnot to overwinter. So we don't have a lot of real rapid weed growth like we do in the spring. We've got warmer temperatures. The soil is going to be a lot warmer this time of year than it's going to be in the spring. So we get a lot quicker germination and development of our turf grasses. And this is also going to allow for more time for root development before we get into the hot, dry part of the summer, where our cool season turf grasses really don't necessarily do all that well. They don't like those conditions. So you can see on the map here on the right, if you're in northern Illinois, kind of last half of August is typically when we're going to be putting our seed down. Central Illinois, mid-August to mid-September, and then southern Illinois, kind of the whole month of September, you've got to plant your cool season turf grasses. Now, when we're going about planting our seed, it's going to be important to make sure we have good contact between the seed and soil. So again, your aerification, something like that. If you're overseeding, if you're going to be putting in a new lawn, make sure you're killing off any of the existing vegetation that's there. You may want to roll that seed into the yard, so again, so you have that good soil contact. You get a lot better germination that way. When it comes to watering, we want to do frequent short waterings. As those plants get established and they start to grow, we can then start cutting back on the frequency and making those waterings longer, so that water gets deeper down into the soil profile to start getting those roots to start going down deeper into the soil and get better established. Also, when you're establishing a lawn from seed, putting down straw over that can help preserve some of that moisture. Typically about 1 bale per 1,000 square feet. Just kind of sprinkle that over, and again, that's going to help retain some of that moisture, so that those seedlings aren't drying out nearly as quickly with that mulch on there. When it comes to fertilizing our lawns, if you're only going to fertilize your lawn once a year, early fall, again, this is for more central Illinois, but again, adjust your times depending on where you are in the state. Kind of mid-August to mid-September is going to be the time to do that. So kind of an easy way to remember: once a year, do it around Labor Day. If you're going to fertilize your lawn 2 times a year, Labor Day and Mother's Day, and then 3 times a year, Labor Day, Mother's Day, and then again around Halloween. It's kind of the easiest way to remember all of that. And typically we're going to put down somewhere around 3 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per growing season. If your grass is in full sun, if it's in shade, you're not going to need to put as much nitrogen down. So about half that rate. So that means if you're going to fertilize once a year, you'd put that 3 pounds all down at once. If you're going to do 2 times a year, you do 1.5 pounds at Labor Day, 1.5 pounds on Mother's Day, and then so on. Make sure you split that up depending on how many times you're going to be applying that fertilizer to your turf. And typically when we're looking for lawn fertilizers, we want a ratio of 3:1:2, 4:1:3, 5:1:2, something like that. Basically, we want that high, first number, that high nitrogen for our turf. That's going to give us that nice green color for it. When it comes to mowing, that last cutting of the year, whenever that may be, you want to do that at the same height you usually do. You don't want to cut it any shorter or any longer. You cut it too long, you start flopping over, you can kind of get some smothering. If you cut it too short, that foliage kind of helps insulate that crown, helps protect it from real cold temperatures. So again, most of our cool season turf grasses, you're going to be cutting that at 2 to 3 inches. So it's your last cut of the year. Just kind of keep doing the way you've been doing. Creeping bent grass, I doubt many people have that in their turf. That's what they use a lot of times for putting greens. That's one you do a lot shorter, but 2 to 3 inches for pretty much all cases is where you're going to want to leave your turf at going in to winter. So just a real quick rundown on some of the different turf things we can do. If you want more information on lawn care, we do have the Lawn Talk website. It does say lawn care for northern Illinois, but central southern Illinois, we're still going to have the same kind of weed and other problems. Planting is going to be similar. Just the dates are going to be a little bit different. A couple weeks difference in central Illinois, maybe a month difference in southern Illinois. So that's basically going to be the main differences, as the timing is just going to be a little different than what they refer to. So all that information is still going to be applicable to you wherever you are in the state for the most part. All right, so next we'll move on to vegetable gardens. So if you've got a vegetable garden, this time of year you just want to keep continuing to harvest our vegetables. And if you're like me, kind of this time of year, mid-September getting into October, you kind of get tired of constantly picking tomatoes, but don't worry, there'll be a frost here soon enough and we'll be done for the year. You still want to continue scouting and managing pests. We do tend to see fewer pests this year, but that doesn't mean we still don't need to potentially manage some that may come in. If you still have pumpkins and stuff like that, squash bugs, making sure you're getting a good handle on those. They're not overwintering and causing you more problems next year, stuff like that. Same thing with weeds. We want to keep managing those weeds. Again, a lot of our weeds this time of year are producing seed, the annuals and stuff. So we want to try to get rid of those, prevent them from producing seed. If we kind of get lazy and allow those plants to go to seed, we're just going to have that many more seeds in the soil that we're going to have to deal with in subsequent years. And when we finally get around to start getting frosts, depending on what crops you're growing, different vegetables are going to have different cold tolerance or frost tolerance. So if you're growing some of our more tender crops, those can be protected to kind of extend that growing season a little bit with them. So when it comes to the different cold tolerances of some of our vegetable crops, we've got our tender vegetables. So these are going to be damaged by a light frost, and the light frost is going to be 32 degrees. So these are our warm season crops that we're going to be planting later in the year after kind of that frost-free date for your area. So kind of what we typically think of as a vegetable garden plant, so our green beans, our tomatoes, our peppers, watermelon, corn, stuff like that. As soon as we start getting cool, we get a frost, those plants are going to start dying back on us. We have our semi-hardy vegetables. These can tolerate a light frost. They may have a little bit of damage to them, but they'll be able to survive it and continue growing. So again, these are some of the crops that we plant a little earlier in the season, so stuff like beets, carrots, lettuce, stuff like that. And then we have our hardy vegetables, and these can tolerate a hard frost, and hard frost is typically considered to be 28 degrees. So again, they may get a little bit of damage there, but they're still going to survive and continue growing. So again, this is some of the stuff that we're planting early in the year, so our broccoli, our cool crops, broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, stuff like that, our peas as well. And this may be kind of hard to see depending on what screen you're looking at, but these are going to be the median frost dates throughout Illinois. So the median date for the first freeze, so that 32 degrees. For here where I'm at in Jacksonville is October 10th. So that's typically when we're going to have kind of our first frost of the year. But we have been as early as September 21st, as late as October 28th. So you can see there can be a big variation in there depending on the year. And then on the right, we've got our first hard freeze, our median first hard freeze. Again, that's 28 degrees. Here in Jacksonville, we're looking at October 22nd. So a couple weeks later than our first frost. That's typically when we get our first hard freeze. So if you want to get this information for where you're at, again, you can talk to your local extension office, or I've got the website down here at the bottom of the screen. You can visit there, and there's a bunch of different maps like this that they've got for either first freeze, last freeze, stuff like that, so you can determine all those dates depending on where you're at in the state. So one thing we can do this time of year, and as we get later into the fall, when we have to start thinking about frost, is doing some season extension. So here on the left, we've got our floating row covers. So this is just kind of a spun fabric, a light fabric that you can drape over your crops, and that's going to provide some protection for them. It's going to retain some of that heat, so if you get a light frost, you can cover those plants, and they're not going to be damaged. You can also do something like a cold frame here. You can repurpose old windows, build a frame, cover that with plastic, something like that. And again, you close that up at night, that's going to retain some of that heat and protect those plants. Then you can see here, you can open these up during the day so your plants don't get cooked. Because this is a lot of times these are glass. A lot of times people will use old windows. You know, that glass is going to let that heat through there. And if we've got a 50, 60 degree day, it can still get quite hot in there, and you could potentially cook your plants. So if you're going to be using a cold frame, make sure you have some way of venting that or opening that up so you don't get too much heat buildup in there. And same thing with this raised bed right here, kind of like basically used a little bit of a floating row cover, but they've made a frame with PVC pipe. Again, they put that floating row cover, plastic, something like that, over that raised bed, again, to retain some of that heat and protect those crops as we get colder. You can do this with some of our tender crops, or you can do this with our frost tolerant or semi-hardy or hardy crops. And again, just keeping those warm and extending that growing season later into the year potentially. So again, we talked about, kind of maintaining the garden. Fall is also a good idea to plant some of these different plants. So just, typically this time of year, September, October, we're starting to wind down our vegetable garden, but it is possible to plant some more stuff. And again, keep your vegetable garden going later into the year. So again, our cool season crops that we're typically planting early in the spring, we can plant those in the summer or in the fall. And again, extend that harvest through fall, and depending on the year, maybe into early winter, depending on how quickly it gets cold or where you are in the state. So some of the different benefits of planting a fall vegetable garden. Again, we often have fewer pest problems. Again, these pests they're getting ready to overwinter. We're not necessarily getting that rapid population explosion like we do in the spring. A lot of times our vegetables are going to be better quality when they're grown in the fall. It's starting to cool off, so when we're growing these cool season crops, as it gets cooler, those are the conditions they really like to grow in compared to the spring. And when we plant broccoli early in the year, as that's starting to get ripe, for lack of a better word, when we're getting ready to harvest that, it's getting warmer and warmer. And sometimes if you wait too long with stuff like broccoli or lettuce, stuff like that, it can get kind of bitter if it starts getting real warm. So if we plant these in late summer or in fall, as they're maturing, it's getting cooler. A lot of times we're going to have better flavor, a little bit sweeter flavor with those because they're maturing under cool conditions instead of warm conditions. And again, you're extending your gardening season. You're going to continue to produce, to harvest produce throughout the year. If you're using some of these season extension things, I've heard of people picking lettuce during Thanksgiving and Christmas. If we have a mild early winter, you can potentially get produce harvested through December. So what and when to plant? So some of these crops, again, so this is Central Illinois, so again, vary this a week or two depending on where you are in the state. So kind of that late July, early August is where we're going to plant stuff like broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, carrots, those crops that have a little bit longer growing season and more time to mature. And if you're going to be doing stuff like broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, you're going to want to do those from transplants. That time of year, at least where I'm at, I have never really seen those available in any of the nurseries or garden centers. So that may be something you have to start from seed on your own. And if you're going to do that, you're going to have to start that several weeks before you're going to want to plant those outdoors. So just keep that in mind. We start getting into mid to late August. We can be planting our lettuce, or mustards, a lot more of our greens, so to speak. And then mid-August through September, again, still planting a lot of those lettuces, those leafy greens as well. Those have pretty good cold tolerance in a lot of those, and they grow relatively quickly. So determine when you need to plant. If there's something you want to plant that's not on this list, basically take your first frost date and count back the number of days to harvest. A lot of times it's recommended to add another 10 to 14 days on there just for the fall factor. As we get later in the year, temperatures are cooling off, our sunlight's getting less intense, we're getting shorter days, so that kind of lengthens that growing period out a little bit. So add a few days just to give yourself a little bit of buffer for that. And if you're going to be planting something that's got a extended harvest time, so peas or something like that, that you're going to have multiple pickings off of, again, give yourself a little more time so you can get multiple pickings off of those plants. There are also planting calculators available. A lot of your online seed companies will have those that are basically you can put in your zip code, put in the crop you want to plant, and it'll spit out when you should start planting that stuff outdoors. And as far as getting your garden ready, your prepping and your planting is just going to be like you would in the spring. So if you need to amend your soils at all, go ahead and add that organic matter, add any fertilizer that you may need. And then if you're planting from seed, just follow those guidelines on the seed packet as far as distance and depth, spacing, all of that information. And when you're planting, so when we're planting in the spring, again, typically it's pretty cool. We have, especially this year, enough moisture. When we're planting in the summer, it's going to be a lot hotter. We tend to be a lot drier in the summer, so watering is going to be a lot more important. You're going to need to stay on top of that. Probably going to have to water your garden a lot more frequently if you're doing a fall garden, at least early in the growing cycle compared to when you would be growing something in the spring. It's also maybe a good idea to provide a little bit of shade for the seedlings, especially in the afternoon when we get that real hot, intense heat. So that may be planting it next to something like tomatoes like that. So when when your seedlings are starting to come up, they can be a little bit shaded. And as those tomatoes start declining, that canopy opens up a little bit and you get more sunlight to those as temperatures start cooling off and those are a little bit better established. You can also place a board. If you're planting in rows, place a board over those seeds. That's going to help retain some of that moisture, keep it a little bit cooler. Just make sure you're checking that fairly frequently so that when those seedlings start to emerge, you can remove that board and they can get the sunlight they need. Garlic, if you want to grow garlic, fall is also going to be the best time to plant that. Garlic requires a cold period in order to produce properly, so that's why we want to do that in the fall. You plant it, it'll start getting established, it'll go through the winter, get those chilling requirements, and then resume growth in the spring. You can plant garlic in the spring. If you're going to do that, you probably need to put that garlic in the refrigerator for, I think it's like 6 to 8 weeks, again, so they get that cold period. And you can get a decent harvest, but typically your harvest is not going to be as good compared to garlic that you plant in the fall. Typically, we want to be planted 6 to 8 weeks before the ground is expected to freeze. So usually that's September to October time range. Further south, southern Illinois, you can probably maybe even get in November potentially to do that. Two types of garlic that we're going to be planting. We've got our hardneck garlic, and this produces a hard stalk called escape. So you can see this on the bottom here, that stalk right here, and same thing here in the middle of that clove when you cut that open. These are a lot easier to peel, but they don't store as well. They really only store for a couple months compared to the soft neck garlic. This does not produce that hard flower stalk. These store quite well, 6 to 8 months, depending on the variety. I've seen potentially up to a year. Some of these can store, but they don't peel as easily. And this is typically the kind that we find in grocery stores because they do store so well. So when it comes to planting garlic, garlic likes well-drained soil that's going to be in full sun. They like a lot of organic matter in the soil, so again, amending your soil with compost or some kind of other organic matter is probably going to be a good idea if you're planting garlic. If you want to fertilize, 2 to 3 pounds of a 10-10-10 per 100 square feet is typically what's going to be recommended for planting garlic. When you get your garlic cloves, you're going to want to order these either online, catalog, buy them in a local nursery or garden center. The stuff you find in the grocery store is usually treated so it doesn't germinate or doesn't sprout. So that's not going to be the best option for planting. You're going to want to get it from somewhere other than the grocery store. So when you get that garlic bulb, you're going to plant those individual cloves, but you don't want to divide that until right before you get ready to plant. So go out, get your soils amended, get everything ready to go, then start dividing your bulbs into those individual cloves. You want to pick the largest cloves to plant. You're going to get the best yields out of those. If you plant real small ones, they're still going to grow, but your yields aren't going to be as good. So plant the big ones first, and if you've got a little extra room, you can put those smaller ones in, or you can use the smaller ones in your kitchen when you're cooking. And obviously, if you've got any that are diseased or soft or broken, don't plant those. You don't want any disease or anything like that spreading throughout your planting potentially. When it comes to planting, 4 to 5 inches apart, 1 to 2 inches deep, and then 15 to 18 inches between the rows. And you want to make sure you're putting the pointed side up. That flat part, that's where the roots are going to be coming from. So make sure that is facing down. And then those will start growing. They'll start producing roots here in the fall. Maybe produce a little bit of a shoot. When we get cold weather, the ground starts to get cold. They'll stop their growth and resume again in the spring. So that's the kind of the basics of a fall vegetable gardening, how to plant and that stuff. When it comes to our garden cleanup, again, harvest any remaining usable vegetables. So if they're predicting a frost, something like that, go out and pick your remaining tomatoes. If the tomatoes are starting to turn that kind of greenish white color, you can still pick those and ripen those indoors. Bring them in. A lot of times people wrap them in newspaper, store them 60, 65 degrees, usually in a basement. Check them periodically once they start to get some color. Put them out on your kitchen counter where it's a little bit warmer. You can remove that newspaper and they'll start to ripen. They're not going to taste as good as if they were ripened on the plant, but you can still get those tomatoes a little bit later into the year. Alternatively, you can just pull up the entire plant and just hang that in the basement and and then just pick those tomatoes off there as they ripen. When it comes to any plants that you have in the garden, plant debris can be tilled into the soil, kind of reincorporated into that. You can put on your compost pile, but you don't want to do that if you've had any disease or insect problems in there. You don't want to till that back into the ground because you're just going to be, all that disease or insects are going to be there. In your soils, you don't want to compost that because most residential composts are not going to get warm enough to kill off those pathogens and stuff. So if you have a lot of pest and disease issues, put that out in the yard waste. If you can burn where you're at, burn it, bury it. Just don't be reincorporating that into the garden or into the compost so you're not spreading those diseases. Again, clean up any remaining weeds before you kind of put your garden to bed. You don't want those going to seed and increasing that seed bank on you. You can also, a good time of year now to add that compost, organic matter. If you need to do any pH adjustments, adding any of those, adding any of that stuff to the soil as well, kind of get a jump start for the spring so you don't have to do some of that stuff come spring. You can also mulch the beds, so again, using straw. When you're out raking your leaves, shred those, put those on the garden, use those as a mulch, help prevent some of that erosion and stuff from bare soils. You can also plant a cover crop, something like a rye, wheat, something like that. There is a 4 seasons gardening series, cover crops, keep it growing, keep it going. That goes into a lot more detail. So if you're interested in something like that, I would encourage you to check out that particular video to learn more about cover crops. And just some more information on vegetable gardening here in Illinois. We've got a couple different websites. Again, you can check those out. If you have questions about specific crops or stuff, those have a lot of profiles on individual crops and stuff that you can get a lot of answers for that stuff. Next, we'll move into more of our ornamental plants. So we'll talk about pruning. So our deciduous plants, those plants that are going to lose their leaves. When it comes for pruning for those, typically we're going to want to wait until they are dormant, kind of late summer, early fall. We don't really want to do much pruning. We don't want to kind of induce any new growth on those plants because that stuff's not going to have enough time to harden off before winter, and it's most likely going to be killed. So hold off until they are fully dormant. They've dropped all their leaves. What have you. This is especially important for trees like oak and elm, where you can get some of the borers moving into those and transmitting disease. You really want to do stuff like oak and elm when they're fully dormant, so you can reduce the risk of getting some of the diseases that are carried by insects that will visit those damaged surfaces. Again, ideally we're pruning February, March. It's a good time to do it because they're going to be dormant. You can see the structure of that tree. You can see if you've got any crossing, rubbing branches growing back into the canopy, stuff like that. When our deciduous trees have lost all their leaves, it's a lot easier to correct a lot of those problems because you can see it a lot easier. Some of our evergreens, depending on the plants, you're going to prune those at different times. Stuff like arborvitae, mid-March and early April is typically when we're going to prune those. Junipers, again, kind of an April time frame. Yews, we can do that late March, mid-June, and then we can also do that again in September. If you've got any kind of real long growth, you can kind of cut that back. If you've got that nice hedge, if you want that nice hedge appearance, you can get rid of some of those longer branches that may shoot out over the summer. Fall is also a good idea or a good time to plant a lot of our trees and shrubs as well. Again, it's cooler. We have fewer large temperature swings than we do in the spring. Our temperatures are a little more moderate. They're kind of gradually going down as compared to the spring, where we get a lot of those wild fluctuations. We get 70-degree days, and then we're back down into the the 30s and 40s a few days later. Again, the soils are easier to work typically in the fall. Our soils are going to be a lot drier, a lot warmer, so they're just easier to work with. And again, like everything else, a lot of times we have fewer insect and disease problems. In the fall, those populations are on the decline compared to the spring, where they're on the upswing. Cold winter temperatures can be an issue, primarily if you're going to be planting something that's kind of borderline hardy for where you're living. If it's a winter hardy plant for where you live, it's typically not going to be an issue, though. Desiccation can be a concern, especially with our evergreen tree species. So if you plant too late, if you're getting in to November, especially with evergreen stuff like that, desiccation can become a concern with some of those. If you are going to be planting a tree or a shrub, just keep in mind some things to think about when you're selecting what plants you want to grow. How large is it going to get? It may look real nice in the landscape now when it's small, but what's it going to look like in 20, 30 years? Is it going to be growing into your house, into a fence, something like that? So keep the big picture down the future in mind when you're selecting plants for planting. When it comes to planting, when we plant trees, you want to place your tree into the hole. Typically, you want to dig that about 2 to 3 times wider than the root ball. If it's been grown in a container, or really any plant you're planting, particularly ones that are grown in containers, though, you want to make sure you're straightening or cutting those circling roots. If you don't correct those before you plant, a lot of times you'll end up getting girdling roots. That will just lead to a slow decline of your tree or shrub, and eventually it'll kind of choke itself and die over a number of years. If you're planting a balled and burlap, make sure you remove that wire and that burlap. They say the burlap will break down, but it takes a long time to do that. And again, you can get into girdling issues, or roots never really leave that burlap. So it's best to remove that, save yourself some problems in the long run, and also make sure it's not too deep. You see a lot of trees that are planted way too deep. If it looks like a telephone pole, it's planted too deep. You can see on this picture here where that arrow is pointing, you want to have this little flare out at the base of the tree. That way you know it's not planted too deep. If it looks like a telephone pole, again, it's going to be too deep. So after you've put that plant into the hole, you want to straighten it and secure it by compacting the soil around the bottom third of the root ball, and then continue to fill that hole and compact that soil. You don't want to amend the soil. That has traditionally been the recommendation, but it's been found more and more that if you have that real nice, you amend that soil, you'll make it real nice, lots of nutrients and stuff. The roots don't really leave that. They don't really go out into the unamended soil as easily. So they just kind of stay in that real nice soil. So don't amend that. You want those roots to spread out throughout the soil. Then also make sure you're thoroughly watering the tree. And again, making sure it's not leaning. If you're doing a good job of compacting the soil, that shouldn't be an issue. It's also going to be important to compact that soil so that tree doesn't settle over time. Because you may think you have it high enough, but as that soil settles, that tree will settle, and you could end up having it planted too deeply. Now, typically we do not want to stake a tree. You really only do that when necessary. So if you're in a real high traffic area, or if an area that's real windy, where that tree is constantly getting whipped around, you can stake it, but you don't want to do it any longer than a year. And you don't want that staking to be real tight. So you want that tree to be able to move still. You want it to be able to form that reactionary wood. If it's just solid, if it doesn't move at all, you have those lines and stuff real tight, it's not going to get that reactionary wood, and it's going to be a lot weaker tree because of that. Mulching. So again, your newly planted trees you want to mulch, or any trees or kind of woody plants. Ideally, we're going to be mulching. So place 2 to 3 inches of mulch, usually wood chips, around the tree. Again, ideally, mulch as large of an area as possible. Ideally, an area equal to 3 feet diameter per inch of tree trunk or tree diameter. So if you have a 2-inch tree, you want to mulch a 6-foot diameter. Again, in a lot of cases, that's easier said than done, but something is better than nothing. So we want to have something that looks like that. So you want your mulch to look kind of like a donut. We don't want mulch placed up over the trunk of the tree. That retains moisture. You start getting a lot of insect and disease problems because of that. They've mulched it, but they didn't really put much down there, so that's really not doing much good for that tree on the picture on the top. You can see here, we've got on the pictures on the left, we've got our thicker mulch or deeper mulch out here, that 2 to 3 inches, and then as we get closer to the trunk, it's just kind of a light covering, basically just enough to cover that bare soil, so we're not stacking that up on the trunk of the tree. So again, you want it to look like a donut, not a volcano. When it comes to getting plants ready for winter, established trees, we can fertilize those once they've dropped the leaves, once those are fully dormant. Those roots are still taking up water and nutrients and stuff as long as that ground isn't frozen. You don't want to fertilize too early. Again, you don't want to promote any new growth on those trees. That's not going to be able to harden off, and that's going to get killed when we start getting cold. And when it comes to trees, you only need to fertilize every once in a while, if at all. In most cases, we probably really don't need to be fertilizing trees. There's enough nutrients and stuff in most of our soils here in Illinois that they can survive just fine without fertilizing. And if you fertilize in the spring, then you don't need to fertilize again in the fall. It's just a once a year type thing in most cases. A lot of times we hear about wrapping tree trunks to prevent winter injury. So with winter injury, basically are called sun scald, several different names. Usually we see it a lot on the south or west sides of trees. Basically those tissues, when we get nice, a little bit warmer sunny days in the winter, those tissues will kind of warm up, they'll kind of reactivate, start growing. Then it gets real cold, they freeze. That freeze thaw, you start getting cracks on the trees. You see that a lot in thin bark trees, cherry, crabapple, maples, stuff like that is where we typically see it a lot. So a lot of people recommend wrapping trees to kind of prevent that. And more of the research is finding that those tree wraps don't necessarily do that good of a job of reducing, of preventing that temperature increase. So it's, it may or may not work all that well. And if you are going to wrap your trees, make sure you're moving that in the spring. Again, that can retain moisture in there. A lot of insects and other critters can get inside of there. So that's only something you want to put on, in the fall or the winter. You want to take that off once it starts to warm up again. But they can be useful in preventing damage from animals. If you have, rabbits or voles or something chewing on trees, or potentially deer rubbing, stuff like that, you could put those tree wraps up there to prevent some of that damage potentially. Winter burn, talked about this a little bit earlier. So basically, this is going to be a real big issue with a lot of our evergreens, especially if we get kind of dry during the fall. These plants retain their needles and their leaves throughout the winter. As we get those cold winter winds, they're still losing water. And if the ground is frozen, they can't take up any water to replace that water they're losing. And you start to get this desiccation, those leaves start dying back. So in the fall, you want to make sure your trees and stuff are well watered, particularly your evergreens. So again, making sure they're getting an inch or two of water per week, whether by rainfall or you are supplementing that by watering them. And if you've got plants that are kind of in an exposed area that get desiccated quite easily or quite often, you can put up some screening, burlap, something like that, to kind of help slow those winds down so they're not desiccating those plants nearly as bad. And then for control of wildlife, we're going to remove any excess vegetation or debris away from the trees and shrubs, away from the bases, so they can't hide in there. So they have to be out in the open in order to get to your trees in the case of voles and stuff like that. Again, you can place barriers around trees and shrubs to kind of prevent some of that feeding damage. If you're going to do that, though, make sure it's 18 to 24 inches above the snow line in the case of rabbits, and about 2 to 3 inches below for mice and voles and stuff, because they can potentially dig underground and chew on roots or the trunk under the soil. You can see here on the left, right here, this in the middle, that's a tree that's had its bark stripped from rabbits feeding on it. And then if you've got branches missing or being chewed off, there is a way you can tell if it's deer or rabbits. Deers are going to have rough edges on the branches they've chewed off, whereas rabbits are going to have that nice clean cut, like somebody pruned it off. If you really want to know what's causing the damage to your plants and stuff, you can also use repellents. These are going to be either area or contact. So like your contact, so there's some hot sauce, like hot sauce type products, then when they feed it, they're going to burn their mouth, so they're not, hopefully discourage them from feeding on it. Your area repellents, dried blood, soap, stuff like that, they're going to smell it and hopefully prevent them from feeding on it. But when it comes to repellents, again, make sure you're reading the label, but you're going to have to constantly reapply these, and it's going to reduce. It's probably not going to eliminate the damage, but it may reduce it. It's not the silver bullet for controlling wildlife damage. So when it comes to our kind of our ornamental beds, ornamental areas of our landscape, when it comes to cleanup for that, if possible, try to leave that landscape as untouched as possible. So leave those standing stalks. If you have ornamental grasses, stuff like that, leave that behind. That dead leaf litter as well. That's going to provide habitat for wildlife. If you're interested in pollinators, a lot of our pollinators will overwinter in that leaf litter, whether that be pupa for butterflies or moths. In some cases, the adults of those butterflies or moths, bees, stuff like that will overwinter in this debris. And also, leaving that debris standing, that's going to catch leaves and stuff, and that's going to help insulate the crown of those plants, so help protect them from cold temperatures and stuff like that. Again, postpone pulling those summer annuals until spring, so pull them and then you can then replace them. Obviously, if you have any diseased plants or you have real big insect problems on something, then yeah, you want to remove those from your landscape so you're not having that inoculum source in your landscape. Get rid of that. But if you don't really have any disease or pest issues, consider leaving some of that stuff stand in your landscape, not only for wildlife, but it can also add some winter interest to your landscape. If you do, if you don't want that kind of a little more disheveled look for your landscape, there could be something where you clean up the front yard but leave the backyard untouched. Just try to leave at least a little bit of a corner of your landscape untouched to provide some of that habitat for some of the wildlife that's overwintering. And just like our vegetables, we do have some annual flowers that can survive well into the fall. Again, a lot of the stuff that we're planting in the spring, in the cooler time of the spring, is also going to do well in the fall. So our half-hardy annuals, these are going to do well in cooler conditions. Not necessarily going to be able to take a frost, but they do like cooler conditions. So geraniums, dianthus, petunia, stuff like that. And then our hardy annuals, these can take colder temperatures, probably can take a little bit of a frost and do just fine. So again, our ornamental cabbages and kales, pansy, snapdragon, stuff like that. And a lot of times if you've planted these in the spring and you've managed to kind of limp them through the summer, a lot of times you'll start seeing these kind of take off again in the fall. But I have seen some of the cabbage and the kale and pansies and stuff available for sale in late summer in a lot of nurseries and garden centers and stuff. So an opportunity to provide some color to your landscape when everything is starting to kind of go dormant and stuff. There are also late blooming perennials that can be planted again to provide some color later in the year. Again, if you're interested in pollinators, again, these are good plants to have. If you look at a lot of our landscapes, we don't have a lot flowering, that September, October time range. So providing some of these plants, these floral resources for those plants can be a good thing for that. So stuff like black-eyed Susan, your Stowy sedum, autumn joy sedum, stuff like that, purple cone flower, blanket flower, all of that will bloom later into the year. Dividing perennials. This is also the time of year that we can divide some of our perennial plants. General rule of thumb, divide spring and summer blooming perennials in the fall and fall bloomers in the spring. So basically you want to do that when they're not flowering so they can put all of that energy into root and leaf formation. So they're not trying to split that in between flowers and that stuff. I'm not going to go into specifics on any particular plants, but Iowa State Extension has a really good document that kind of goes through the different types of perennials that are out there and when the best time to divide those are. So if you just do a search for that on the internet, that pops up. So then when it comes to the plants that we're going to be dividing in the fall, again, we're going to do that late summer, early fall. Again, we want to allow those plants, 4 to 6 weeks to kind of, again, get established, grow some more roots before the ground freezes. Again, ideally, we're not going to divide on hot, sunny days. Wait till it's a cloudy day, and even better if we're going to have some light rain in the forecast. Again, keep that soil moist. You're disturbing a lot of those roots. They don't really like hot conditions, but again, if you only have a couple days you can do it, you got to do it when you can do it. But ideally, we want cloudy and kind of rainy conditions. It makes establishment that much easier for those plants. So just how do you determine if your plants need to be divided? A lot of times we'll start getting reduced flowering on these plants, and the flowers are getting smaller. They're just kind of outgrowing their area. They're getting thin and stuff. They're not producing as much food and stuff for themselves, so you start seeing that flowering decline. They can start looking like a donut. So you can see here in this picture, most of that growth is on the outside of the plant. That center has completely died back. Again, that's a good indication that that plant needs to be divided. If it's a plant that doesn't flop or just kind of open up, if it doesn't typically do that, it's not supposed to do that. Again, that's a good indication that it needs to be divided. Or if it's just gotten too large for the area, it's starting to overtake other plants it's growing in to your house, stuff like that. If it's just getting too large for the area, that would be another reason you may want to divide a particular plant. So when it comes to dividing them, you want to dig that plant out, lift it out of the ground, cut it into clumps. You can see that in these pictures down here. So they've dug that out, lifted it out. They're sectioning that. Make sure you have several growing points per division. And again, inspecting those plants if you have any disease or damaged areas, just discard that. You don't want to put that back into the landscape and potentially let it spread. We can also keep on planting perennials this time of year in late summer, early fall. You can really do that into the end of September. And again, just like trees, make sure you're not planting them too deep, kind of that same depth they were grown before. Again, making sure to keep them moist so you can get that root formation so they can get well established. And again, mulching those to help moderate that soil temperature so you're not getting those wild temperature fluctuations that we can see in the winter sometimes. And also help protecting that crown can help with your success overwintering those plants. When it comes to roses, if we want to make sure that our roses are kind of hardened off, they're ready to go into winter. So we want to make sure we stop fertilizing them after mid-August. We don't want to push any more new growth on those plants. Again, there may not be enough time for that stuff to harden off, so it's going to get killed when we start getting cold temperatures. And again, stop deadheading beginning of October, again, so you're not stimulating new growth on those plants. If you're going to cover your plants, wait until the leaves have dropped. Usually temperatures are starting to get into the teens. It's going to be a pretty good indication that plant's going to be fully dormant. And before you do cover, make sure you're cleaning up any foliage or other debris. You have black spots, something like that. Get as many of those leaves out of there as possible so you don't have that inoculum source for next year. Occasionally, you may need to prune them back a little bit to reduce the height, depending on how you're going to cover them. And if you have real long canes, again, you can cut those back to prevent those from whipping around in the wind and damaging the plant. Kind of three primary ways people protect the roses during the winter, if you do protect them at all. Again, a lot of this is going to depend on where you are in the state and the type of rose you're growing, how hardy it is in your area. One way you can just, again, making sure they're completely dormant, placing mulch over the crown about 10 to 12 inches deep. And by mulching this stuff and by covering this stuff, we're not necessarily making it any warmer. It's just keeping that uniformly cold so we don't get those big temperature fluctuations, those wide swings of temperature. We want to try to keep it evenly, uniformly cold throughout the winter. You can also kind of build a fence, use a wire frame and burlap on the outside. That's a chicken wire hardware cloth, something like that. Just make a big circle around it, fill that with mulch. Or you can also use the rose cones, and that's that picture in the corner there. A lot of times these are going to be styrofoam covers that you're going to place over the plants. You do want to make sure you have holes in there because these are styrofoam. They're not going to breathe all that well, so you don't want moisture accumulating in there. You want to be able to make sure that moisture can escape so you don't, so it doesn't get too wet in there. You don't get any disease problems and rot, stuff like that going on in there. Again, mulch the crown of the plant, put that cone over, and then make sure you secure that cone. Put a brick on the top. Drive some stakes into the sides, what have you. Just make sure that cone's not going to be blown away if we get some high winds. Fall is also the time of year we're going to be planting our spring bulbs. So these are the bulbs that are going to be flowering come spring, so your tulips, your daffodils, hyacinth, stuff like that. Again, we're planting this before the ground freezes. Planting depth, general rule of thumb, 2.5 to 3 times the diameter of the bulb. So if you have a 1-inch diameter bulb, you want to plant that 2.5 to 3 inches deep. But again, check the package. If you don't have the package, that's the general rule of thumb. Again, cover the bulbs with backfill. Add gently, kind of tamp that down as well. Then you can fertilize. Typically, it's 10-10-10 fertilizer, and some people also add some bone meal into that. That's got that high phosphorus, which helps with the root formation and flowering as well. If you have issues with squirrels or other critters digging up your bulbs, you can try putting chicken wire over the bulbs and then backfilling when they start digging and hit that chicken wire. Hopefully that will discourage them from going any further and feeding on your bulbs that you've planted. We also have our summer bulbs. These are the bulbs that we're going to be planting in spring. So stuff like calla lilies, caladium, dahlias, what have you. These are not going to be winter hardy in Illinois, so if we don't dig these, they're going to die. So typically we're going to start bringing them in end of September, beginning of October. Once that foliage starts to yellow, or maybe we've had a light frost, the top growth gets killed back, you want to dig those up, prune off the tops, then bring them in. Let them dry out for a few days, probably in a basement, or if you have a insulated or heated garage, you don't want those bulbs or those corms getting too cold. Let them dry for a few days. A lot of times they're stored in peat moss or vermiculite. Again, a lot of it's going to vary on the type of plant you have, how you're going to store it. Typically between 50 and 60 degrees is the temperature you're going to store them at. And then keep the humidity levels low. You don't want those to start sprouting in the basement during the winter. Also don't want to store those near fruit. That ethylene gas can damage those bulbs or those corms, whatever you have. So avoid storing those near there. And again, make sure you're checking those periodically. So there's no, if you notice any of them getting soft or starting to rot, again, remove those so it's not spreading throughout all the other stuff you've got stored. House plants, if you move your house plants outside during the summer, when we start getting temperatures down into the 50s at night kind of consistently, so when we want to start thinking about bringing our house plants back in. Again, for the most part, a lot of these are going to be tropical plants, so they're not going to tolerate cold temperatures. Before you bring them indoors, make sure you're checking them for any pests or diseases. You don't want to bring that inside, and then you're going to have a pretty big problem come winter as those pests are removed from some of their natural enemies and those populations really start exploding. So if you've got a plant that's got some pest issues, quarantine that, put it away from all your other house plants, and then if necessary, treat that in order to get rid of that problem. When you bring them indoors, put them next to a nice, bright, sunny window. Again, they've been growing outside where you've got a lot of good light, so bring that in and try to get them as much light as possible. But oftentimes, their leaves are going to start turning yellow. They're going to start dropping. We're bringing them outside where they've got plenty of light, pretty good humidity. We bring them inside. We've got a lot less light. Our houses are a lot drier, and it's going to take them some time to acclimate to that. So a lot of times they will start dropping leaves, and those leaves will start turning yellow. But eventually they'll acclimate, and they'll start to put on new growth and kind of look healthy again for you. When it comes to houseplants, as far as watering goes, especially during kind of the winter months, when they're not really actively growing, do the finger test. Stick your finger in up to your first knuckle. If it's dry, you probably want to water. And again, this is going to vary depending on the houseplant. Some like drier conditions or wetter conditions than others, but kind of general rule of thumb, this is what to do. Again, water until the water runs out of the bottom of the pot. Hopefully they are in a pot that have drainage holes. If not, you may want to repot them. And then discard any of that water that's drained out of the pots. When it comes to fertilizing over the fall and winter, growth slows down quite a bit. They may not even grow much at all, so you really don't have to do much fertilizing, if any. If you do, probably a half strength, probably once a month is going to be more than enough for most plants in most cases. Because our houses are quite dry during the winter, anything you can do to increase the humidity is going to help those plants out. They're going to be a lot happier in more humid conditions. So one thing you can do is put your pot on a tray filled with pea gravel, put water in that, and place that pot on top of that. Just make sure that water line is below the pot, and as that water evaporates, it'll increase that humidity in the vicinity. Also, kind of grouping all of your house plants together will help increase the humidity as well. And if you're a real hardcore person or you have a lot of houseplants, you can always get a humidifier and set that up around your plants to increase the humidity in the area. So that's all I've got. And again, just kind of a real quick rundown of some of the different activities we can do during the fall or consider doing during the fall. Here's my contact info. If you have any questions that you don't think of, feel free to give me a call, send me an email. We do have other four seasons. We've been doing this for I don't know how many years now, but there are a lot of them that have been recorded, put up on YouTube. So there are a lot of other topics. Some of these topics I've just kind of barely scratched the surface on. There are other Four Seasons recordings on some of these different topics. So if you want some more information on some of these different topics, this may be a good place to look for some of that. And with that, we'll do questions. If you have a smartphone and a QR code reader app on there, you can take a picture of that, and that'll take you to the survey, or you can type in that go.illinois.edu/Four Seasons Fall Gardening and get to the survey that way as well. So for soil testing, do you need to have a specific amount of soil for test? And do you need specific containers? So typically, I think it's about a cup or so is the amount of soil you need. You don't need a tremendous amount. Basically, you take all those individual samples that you've taken from the area, mix those together real well, and just take a cup of that and send that off. As far as containers, I would contact the company you're going to be sending it to. They may have bags or containers that they can send you to send that in. A lot of times, put it in a paper bag and then put it in a box to send it off. You don't necessarily want to put it in a plastic bag because it's going to retain the moisture, and they need that soil to be dry in most cases to do that analysis on the soil. What's the best way to treat house plants for pests? A lot of times if it's stuff like aphids, some of our smaller soft-bodied insects, you can give them a good spray of water, knock those pests off. You may have to do that a couple times if that may be all you have to do. If it's a real bad infestation, you may have to go more of a chemical route, and there are pesticides labeled for houseplants. Just make sure if you are going to use an insecticide, make sure it's labeled for use on houseplants. Or if it's real bad and it's not a real valuable plant, you may be better off tossing it and just starting over. It just kind of depends on how bad that pest population is for you. Should you fertilize newly planted perennials? And if so, how much, how often? Ideally you would do a soil test beforehand to see if you would need to do that, but you could probably treat it kind of like, and it's kind of with a lot of our perennials and stuff, a lot of times, again, depending on where you are in the state, most of our soils are going to have plenty of nutrients in there to begin with. So before you get real crazy with fertilizing, you probably want to do a soil test to see if you really even need it to begin with.
I agree with that, and then I would just add for the fall planted perennials, it's actually recommended that you really just mulch them in the fall and then fertilize come the spring, because you want to water well in the fall so they can establish their root growth, but you don't want to push too much hardy above ground growth before the winter comes.
Would you recommend buying garlic to plant? I usually just get it off of a mail order, kind of online places. There's a lot of different places that sell garlic. You just don't want to use the stuff you're going to be buying from the grocery store that you would use to cook with. They'll treat that to prevent it from sprouting, so it doesn't really grow all that well in the garden for that, unless they're selling it for the purpose of planting. Probably don't want to get it from the grocery store. So for pruning fruit trees, typically we're doing that, depending on where you are in the state, but or later, kind of that mid to late winter, kind of February, March timeframe, at least where I'm at, is typically when we're pruning our fruit trees and stuff. I mean, you can prune them earlier if you want. I don't know if you want to be going outside in the middle of January. when it's 10 degrees outside and pruning. Basically, you want to for fruit trees you want to prune those before those buds start swelling.